Hi everyone, day 3 of the challenge. Okay, so today we are building up on day 1 and day 2. So we have sketched out your idea, we've talked about the importance of knowing your materials, and today is details, and that's again super important. So that's like next level complexity. And it is important because you can't get the results that you want if you don't know what you want made. And you don't have to be a seamstress to really understand how to make your product, but you really need to know. The more you know and the more you find out, the better outcome you will get. And when I started my jewelry brand some years back, as I told you before, I did not know how to make jewelry. I didn't train in jewelry, but I knew what I wanted. And so I found references. I went to cheap jewelry shops and I bought really cheap jewelry, but that gave me an idea of the size. And I found images on the internet of the kind of texture, which then I could put forward and discuss with my manufacturer how to, get these results. And I also studied my competitors. I knew what kind of price point I wanted to achieve. I worked backwards and I found what it should cost me to make. And then with my sketch, an idea of what I wanted to make, with materials, knowing what materials I wanted to use, and with an idea of the kind of details that I wanted to have in order to achieve the end result that I was looking for, I was able to then communicate this to my manufacturer and discuss the project and see what's viable and what's not. Because at the end of the day, if you are doing it as a hobby, great. You can, it's freer to do it as a hobby, right? You don't have any constraints. You can change your mind. You can do whatever. But the minute you want to put your ideas turn your ideas into a product and work with someone to execute them, and you also have a price in mind, you want this to become a commercial project that you will be rewarded for the time and effort you're going to put into it, then you need to make sure that it's viable. And viability means that someone can make it, someone will buy it, and all of the complexity that goes along the way. So knowing what you want to make, even if you're not an expert seamstress, if you didn't go to college, etc., it doesn't matter. There's other ways, to know to get to that result. But it has to start with you knowing what you want. Okay, so that's why the details, as they say, the devil is in the details. The details are really important. And the details are important as the next stage of you vetting your manufacturer. So remember, I was thinking this morning how to explain to you, but a simple way to explain is that when you're looking for a manufacturer, you're looking for them. So it's up to you to vet them and to make sure that they're right for you. They're just there. If they, however, and when a manufacturer is looking for a designer brand to work with, they do the same kind of groundwork. They're looking for, who to contact, who is well aligned with them, and then they're pitching them in a way and telling them, please move your production to us. This is how we are better than someone else, or this is how we are competitive, etc. So when they come to you, they will be doing exactly the same as what you would be doing to them when you are going to them. So being that you're the designer with an idea, looking to start, you need to find them and you need to pitch them on your idea. So it's up to you to be clear. I saw someone had left a comment in one of the questions that I asked in order to enter the group, and it was something along the lines of, I'm looking for a manufacturer who communicates clearly. It's a two-way relationship, right? So yes, they do have to communicate clearly, but the onus is on you to communicate in the first place and continuously clearly. And if they're not very clear, remember day 0, the talk that I gave you, that about how different in terms of skills, abilities to communicate, education, etc., those two parties are. The onus is on you to make sure that you are clear at all times. And if they're not very clear, or you're not very clear on what they mean, ask questions. Make sure that you always get that clarity by you being clear in the first place, and keep on pushing them to give you the clarity that you need in order to make good decisions. So when you're looking for a manufacturer, you need to know what is going to go into your product. And there's 4 reasons why you need to do this. But let me just tell you, let me take it back to the dating. Remember the dating analogy. So in dating, I said to you that you need to know what you're looking for in order to find the perfect partner. And when you go on a first date, you don't go and straight away say, okay, this is my checklist, this is what I'm looking for. Initially you go on a date just to, get a sense, do you like this person? Is there like a synergy, etc.? And the same thing has to happen with the manufacturer. Initially, when you make an inquiry, that's why you have the sketch. That's step 1. I'm looking to make something. Can you do it? This is what it is, blah, blah. And they said, you have a sketch? Yeah, no problem. You send the sketch by email or whichever way you're discussing and communicating with them. So that's step 1. And then there's a little bit more information. You have already been thinking through to the materials. So you tell them, it will be in this fabric. Can you work with it? Blah, blah, blah. And then it's only when you can see that they're willing, you get a good sense, the discussion is happening. That's when you then go deeper into step 3, and you start discussing the details. And you can't discuss the details if you don't know what they are. So let me tell you why you need to know the details. Drop me any questions if you have as I keep going, and then I'll come back and answer them. So 4 reasons why you need to know the details. Reason number 1 is that you need to know how your garment is going to be constructed. So the sketch that you did on day 1, great. It's a great beginning. It opens the door to communication. But then that sketch you would be using with your manufacturer. You would be using that sketch with someone who's going to be making your first prototype or sample. And you'll be using with that sketch with someone who's going to make your pattern, because pattern is the first step towards making your sample. And very often, part of the problem why people can't find manufacturers, and when they find manufacturers it doesn't work out, is that they are stuck on step 1. They at best have a sketch that is not very detailed, and then they think that everyone else down the line, the process, somehow miraculously has this ability to read mind. So let me tell you that nobody's got a crystal ball. Nobody can read the mind. There's no that hasn't been yet invented. And certainly, as I often say, the fashion industry is quite backward. So, if mind reading gets invented, fashion will probably be the last industry to cotton onto it. So nobody reads minds. If you want to get a result, you have to make sure that you're super clear. So your pattern cutter, unless you tell them what you want, they're not going to know to put it in there. I had a client sometime, long time ago, who had followed from reading blog posts and articles. She had done some sketches, but with zero detail, and they were more like illustrations. They were quite stylized. And she had bought material without really thinking and understanding the nuances and the difference in material. So I think that she wanted to make a stretch dress that was very kind of figure hugging. And she went and bought jersey material, knitted, that had a stretch, but it was very thick jersey. It was more like a sweatshirt kind of material. And her drawing was very basic, and it had no scale to it. So at this point, you can start adding scale to your drawing. Hers had no scale, and she had hired a seamstress that was not equipped to work with, she hadn't asked the questions like you would now. And she wasn't equipped to work with stretch materials. And then she called me up crying because it was a disaster and she had to pay for the disaster. And why was it a disaster? Because it had it looked nothing like drawing, which was in her head already, this amazing finished garment. It was completely wrong. It had no shape, and it was meant to be hugging, the body. It was short, it was meant to be long. So there was a series of things. So when she sent me all the documentation so that we can unpick and unravel the mystery, she wasn't clear. She was clear, but she did not document it on paper, and therefore her instructions, there was no instructions. She was left, she gave materials and sketch and assumed that this lady was going to somehow make magic, and in between read her mind. So it's really important that you know what you want and you work out those details, because they have to be communicated to the people down the chain you're working with. And it starts with your pattern cutter. If your pattern cutter doesn't understand what you want, they're not going to make you a good pattern, and you'll be paying for a mediocre or not a good pattern. And then from there, you'll be limping all the way, down the line, and paying, limping and paying, right? And wasting time at the same time. So really important to know your details. Secondly, by knowing the kind of details you want, it further defines the type of product you want to create, the type of brand you're working on, and where you're going to sit in the market. Because if you pick any of the clothes that you have in your wardrobe, if you pick an expensive item from a designer brand that you might have, and something that you might have from, let's say, Primark, H&M, something like this, if you look at the kind of detailing, you would understand the difference, why you paid little versus you paid more. Seams, for example, out of the high street, they would be overlocked. They have these machines with 3 or 4 threads, and they just keep the seams tidy. If you look at a designer garment, that would be completely different finished. And this is the difference between something that is lower end of the market and something that is higher end of the market, not to mention something that is bespoke and couture. So just to say to a manufacturer that you want something to be luxury, what does that mean? You have to tell them what. Especially nowadays when everyone uses the word sustainable, the word luxury, everyone has, they're overused, and they mean different things to different people. So it's up to you to define and back up your brand positioning, where you want to stand in the market, by thinking through those details and communicating them then to your pattern cutter, to your sample maker, factory, etc. And then don't forget that later on, once you launch your brand, that's a whole other topic, but later on you will be using these details as part of your marketing. You would be justifying why you are a luxury brand as opposed to, let's say, fast fashion, and that would be the attention to detail. So you need to know what these details are, and you cannot leave them for someone else to decide, let alone your factory, because most factories will opt for something that, most factories from experience, they know that designers, especially young designers, startups, etc., they want something amazing for less money. So they would cut corners to save you money, because the assumption is that you will not be wanting to pay more. So if you want to get what you want, you have to say what you want. Third reason to know what kind of details are important to you is that, because again, you can then verify that the factory you're going to work with can do that. You can ask them, I would like to have, for example, I saw that someone put in the group just now a picture of a shoe, and it had piping. So you can, knowing that you want to have piping in the shoe, you can speak to the manufacturer and say, if you look at my design, you will see that, I have a piping detailing in there. Do you have the machine to do this piping? Or if they say, no, we don't have the machine, so how are you going to do this piping? Will you give it to someone else? Will you do it by hand? Oh, you will do it by hand. Have you done it by hand before? Is that something that you often do for your clients? Piping, how expert are you? How skilled are you at doing this piping, etc.? So these are the kind of questions that you have to ask, because there's no point going down the line again, wasting time and money to make a sample, and the piping is like really shoddy, really uneven, badly done, and then you learn that they don't know how to do the piping. This was the first time, or they can't do it, so they gave it to someone, Joe Blogs down the road, who did it for them. And it is what it is, right? So the onus is on you, as always, to make sure that you, knowing what you want, you discuss it with your manufacturer. And the fourth really important reason to know your details at this point is that, actually, let me write a fifth one. I just thought of a fifth one. The fourth one, however, is that detailing affects the price. So if you're a price-conscious brand, you have to, but you want particular details, you have to discuss them with your manufacturer and see what is the cost, because time in making something equals money. So the more complicated your design is, the more time the factory will take, to make it, the more it will cost you. And very often, again, there's a lot of similarities. People who don't know the fashion industry, and this is where manufacturers get so, frustrated with the startups, but they want things that they want them because they don't understand how it works. So often what meet is that the people who say, I want a luxury, my brand is going to be luxury, but I want to find someone who is sustainable, a whole other question. But I want to find a sustainable factory with small MOQ and not very expensive. And all of these things together, they cannot work. So if your design is very complicated, it's going to cost you money. If you're going to be price conscious about, there's a ceiling to how much you can charge for something, then you need to work backwards and you need to simplify your design. You need to make sure that your materials come to a certain price point. You need to work backwards to make sure that, the math stacks up and you can get to that price point. And if you add the complexity of, I want really couture, fine detailing, a particular type of seams, etc., that's a luxury end techniques. They would take money to do. A lot of them also done by hand, by skilled machinists with many years of experience who charge more, and the factory will charge you more. So therefore, you cannot have this level of complexity and detailing and be a mid-market brand or fast fashion, let's say, or if you're not fast fashion, compete with fast fashion. You really need to understand what are you building as a business in order to find the right manufacturer to translate your ideas into a product. So that's really important. So for example, I'll just give you some examples of things so you know what I'm talking about. But patch pockets, if you put like a little patch pocket on a garment, it's much simpler than if you're doing a pocket that is kind of encased and it's hidden, or it has a welt opening on the side or on top of something. It's a lot more labor intensive, that kind of pocket, than just cutting a rectangle and stitching it, folding it at the edges and stitching it on top of a garment. What else have I written down? Invisible zips versus a normal zip. Invisible zip, you need a special machine foot. It takes, a little bit more care. You need to be known. I mean, I can sew, but I cannot do an invisible zip, So that's an extra level of skill that you need to you find in your maker, and that would cost you more money. Then buttonholes. You can have a machine make a buttonhole, or you might want a buttonhole that is made by hand, and that is more time, so it's going to cost you more money. So these are little details that it's good to put down on paper and discuss with your manufacturer. And I have been in situations where, knowing what I know, I'm working with a design, I know what my price point is, and it's coming a few euros, or dollars or whatever it is, too expensive, right? And especially when you are starting out and everything costs you more because you don't have the scale, or if you're working in a brand who wants to expand their margins, every penny counts. And even though it's just a few euros, I have to remove this few euros, right? So I would sit with the manufacturer and I'll go through, I'll be completely open and say to them, it's 5 euros more expensive. I need to lose 5 euros. What can we do? So let's look, I have 2 internal pockets. Do I need one? If I remove one of the pockets, how much would it be? Sometimes it's negligible cost because it's such an easy little pocket, and just a seam, just the stitching creates the pocket. So removing that stitching is nothing. Maybe you remove zips, maybe you change, from metal zips to plastic zips. That reduce the cost of the zip, not necessarily of the labor, but of the material. Maybe your lining is too expensive, and just by changing the lining, that would bring down the cost. Maybe you just eliminate pockets altogether, so you don't have them. Even if it's a patch pocket, it might be just, a couple of euros that you save because it's cutting time, it's the material and stitching it, right? So you remove that and you look, what else can I do? What else, but you have to do it together with your factory because they know and they'll give you ideas. And you have to be flexible to amend your design. So that's why knowing your details is so important. And the final fifth reason that I just thought of to add is that one thing that manufacturers hate so much, I cannot even begin to tell you, is designers who change their minds. So while, it is understandable that as you're making your product, changes will happen inevitably for one reason or another, it is your job to try to minimize those changes, because any change that you make down the process, it's going to annoy the hell out of them, because it means that they may have to start the process again and they cannot charge you for it. It's going to be very difficult. You're going to dispute that cost, and it's going to strain the relationship. If you change something in your design while you're already making it, it may mean that you have to go away and get some new materials or redraft your pattern or do something, which means that they're disturbing their flow. And remember, they make money from production when they're in the flow. Factories calculate every 1 minute of working time has, it has an assigned value. So if you're going to waste time to redraft something, etc., they're going to waste time to stop, look at their schedule, and figure out who else can they put in your place. And then if they start working on someone else who's got their stuff together and they're in the flow, and you come back with your changes, you can't expect to, someone was asking me about fashion shows, working to a timeline. If you step out of the process and they put someone else in the manufacturing line and they're working on them, you can't expect them to drop that person and get back to you because you just now sorted now you know what you want, etc. It doesn't work like that. So you're going to have to wait your turn again, which means that you might be really late, which means that you're going to be stressed, you're going to be stressing them out. They're not going to want to disappoint you. They'll be getting stressed out, and there's plenty of stress without having to add that kind of stress on top. So changing your mind as little as possible is really important. So please remember that factories absolutely hate it. And if you stress them out, they start cutting corners, because at the end of the day, they have to get paid. And when they cut corners, you're not going to get the quality that you want. So can you see how it's a vicious circle? But that vicious circle starts with you and it ends with you. And that is really the point of this challenge and this training. I really want everyone to understand that you are not just a passive partaker, and the whole industry is against you, and it's so difficult to find a manufacturer. You're in the crux of it. If you can't find someone, it's because you're not doing your job. If there's mistakes, by and large, for the majority of the times, it's going to be down to you that these mistakes happened. If the relationship falls apart, by and large, for the majority of the time, it would probably start and end with you, because you have to manage your factory, etc. But the manufacturers are your most important partner in your business, because without them, you have no product. But you have to learn how to manage yourself, your expectations all around, and them, and the process. So being a creative in this day and age, there's very little room for creativity. Everything else is really important, and that's what it takes to become a successful fashion designer. And then obviously, as you start growing, you can, employ people to do all of this for you. But at the beginning, you really need to master the communication and how you communicate your ideas on paper and then verbally. So let me have a look at questions. Is it better to have a manufacturer that provides pattern cutting, or does it not matter? It really depends on your product. So if it's imagine, what is the purpose of a factory? The purpose of a factory is to make something. So not all factories will provide pattern cutting as a service. If they do provide it as a service, it's probably better to assume that it's basic pattern cutting skills for something that is simple. But if your product is really more complicated, more technical, someone in the group was doing draping, for example, or if it is something that is like, let's say, to do with tailoring, you're better off going and finding a pattern cutter outside of the factory, working with them, finalizing your pattern, being absolutely happy with the sample of, how it looks, and then going and finding a factory. So that would probably be the better way, but it really depends on your design. And most factories will not necessarily have a pattern cutter. They might have someone who will understand, who might make small little tweaks, but they would not be employing a proper pattern cutter, let's say. So they might have some level of skills, but not be necessarily a pattern cutter. And also, if you're doing sizes, you would have to grade it, and you would need someone who understands. I wouldn't necessarily trust, unless it's a t-shirt, but I wouldn't necessarily trust a factory to do my sizing. Make sure your samples are done to perfection before final. Yep, you have to really make sure that your sample is as perfect as possible, because that becomes your, master for what you want. And usually samples production is not as good as samples, because obviously sample more time has been taken, to do to pay attention to the detailing. Something always slips up in production. So if your sample is not perfect, how is your production going to be close to perfect? Having said that, if you have a sample where something really little is missing. So for example, let's say that you want your stitching, the stitch size is a bit bigger, you would like it to be a little bit smaller. You can specify that. You don't have to make yet another sample with the correct stitching. You can specify that, and you can ask request for a sample as part of your production to just okay, or you can pop into your factory depending on where you live and if you can visit your factories, but to check that this detail has been seen to. So yeah, be reasonable. Remember, factories hate making samples, but they have to make them, so there's no choice. So keeping it to a minimum is best. And also samples cost money. It's more expensive to do samples from production. So if you're especially on a budget, just be reasonable. And yeah. I have a question about samples and patterning. Since those were brought up today, I'm coming to is it helpful to approach a factory with a sample I have made to explain my construction choices? Same thing with providing them a pattern I have drafted myself. Is this helpful? Yes, it is. So yes, the more you can take to a factory up front, when you're first approaching them, the better. The advantage of making outside of a factory a sample, especially if you can sew yourself, if you have drafted your pattern, etc., it's great. You're saving a lot of money, and then you're going with something. You're starting the conversation like a few steps up. This is my sample. Can you make it or not? And for them, it's really important. Seeing something as a sketch and as a physical product, it's two different things. They would look. You can show them the kind of level of attention of detail you want, the kind of finishing you want, especially if you're really good at sewing, etc. If you have made your sample somewhere else with a pattern cutter, a factory would want the pattern. So whether you drafted it or a pattern cutter, they don't care. As long as you're happy with the pattern, they can use it to make, your sample in production. If you have a sample, no matter if you work with an outside studio or you make your own sample and you then look for a manufacturer, they would have to make the first sample, because the first sample will allow them to show you that they can make it. So you're testing them that they can make it to the level of quality that you want and can make it full stop. But secondly, it allows them to give you the price. So you can either go with the sketch and start from the beginning, and they do that, or you can go with your own sample made by you or someone else, etc., start the discussion, and then they just copy it. It would be just a bit faster. You're cutting out some time of them toing and froing, asking you questions, etc., etc. So it's much faster for them. So yeah, factories like that. Do manufacturers think favorably of files using fashion software, CAD? Yeah, more. I mean, you have to see more and more factories are getting in with 21st century, and they're using technology. So you just have to ask them. But if you work with smaller factories, sometimes they might not have CAD. So then you just have to, if you really like them and you want to work with them, it's just a question of someone printing the CAD. And yeah, so you just have to ask them. What are the best avenues to get fashion funding? Oh, that's a whole other. If you go on my blog on fashioninsiders.co, in the blog, in the search type financing, there's an article that will give you some ideas of how you can approach it. Okay, this is it. I have to rush off now, but if you have any more questions, pop them in the chat and I'll answer them. And on to more technical discussions tomorrow. So we are done with the creativity and sitting down and sketching. Tomorrow we are getting into more important topics, more businessy kind of topics. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow and seeing your next task. Thanks a lot. I'll see you in the group.